Why, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me? Sorry. Sorry, I've been having some technical difficulties. I hope you can hear me all now. I'm gonna get started. Sorry, I had a few things I had to sort through to get this working. So yeah, it's been quite a week, hasn't it? The Epstein files. Let's chat about that. I don't even know where to start. I released the first 10 parts of my crisis series essays, and then we had the dump of the Epstein files. Um, I sort of gave myself permission to spend quite a bit of time going through them myself because I wanted to deeply understand some of the things going on in there. In particular, I there are people in those files, people who interacted with Jeffrey Epstein and his associates that I have known in my professional life personally, and you can imagine, you know, me wanting to sort of understand, you know, sort of the happenings of Epstein's world that existed just beyond the horizon of the one step removed position that I found myself relative to some of these other individuals who knew Jeffrey Epstein personally. I don't know Jeffrey Epstein. What's interesting is that I knew very little of Jeffrey Epstein um, in my until the whole thing happened when he got arrested and went to prison. I knew very little about him and the island, and my first real um like like the first time that I ever started thinking about Jeffrey Epstein like seriously was when he committed suicide, right, in 2019. And because there was a whole bunch of people in my life that didn't believe that he committed suicide. They thought he was murdered. And that kind of colored my perception of the Epstein issue. If I'm being like quite honest, um, it it probably caused me to like not pay attention to it very closely for the very reason that I have a sort of allergy to conspiratorial thinking. So when I had people in my orbit who were sort of really obsessed with Epstein and the circumstances of his death in the prison, um, and also the whole thing around QAnon and such, I was kind of allergic to it, I guess, and didn't pay that close attention to it until recently. Maybe that was a mistake. I mean, I have quite a few observations about Mr. Epstein, having now spent dozens of hours over the past week researching Jeffrey and him, and sort of kind of teaching myself about his life, about his relationships, in particular the relationships that he had with people that I know personally. I haven't communicated with any of these people, just to be clear. I haven't really communicated with many people in the last week. I've been kind of, other than some people who I'm close to personally, I've been kind of just really just sort of battered down, really trying to understand the scope of these files and these revelations that we've seen. and trying to build a coherent picture for myself to understand like what I'm looking at, and trying to fit the Epstein story into like a broader story of elite culture and the corruption of the elite. And I've come to a bunch of troubling conclusions, disturbing conclusions about um, a lot of things. Quite honestly, it's made me update my priors a little bit on human nature. It's I you know one of the things I've actually been quite fascinated by, um, because I'm for those of you who like follow my more philosophical work, you know that I I focus a lot on the sort of this the sub discipline in philosophy of epistemology. And one of the things I'm quite fascinated by, like in general, is how different people perceive things, right, from their various perspectives. Like, what do I mean by that? I mean, um, if you present like a circumstance, right? Like, for example, like let's take the murder of Renee Good. Um, there's different ways of viewing that video. I view that video inside the world of my own morality, which is a liberal morality, right? I call myself a liberal and practice liberal ethics, which I consider a humanist tradition. We can talk about that uh, at some point at length again, because I have some thoughts about um, sort of the implications here for sort of thinking about um, political ideology and governance and political systems. But like through that view, I mean, Renee Good was murdered, right? I mean, just to kind of play devil's advocate. Not that I'm saying that you should play devil's advocate, but just for the purposes of philosophical clarity, right? Like you could look at that video and you could have the moral view that like you should just always obey authority, and if you don't obey authority, then you just get what's coming to you. I mean, that's what some people believe. I mean, that's what some people on the right who think Renee Good deserved to die for what she did think, right? I mean, people think that, right? I think it's a morally reprehensible worldview. But you can view it that way if you want. And people do. We see it. We see it. We see this with our fellow citizens. Some people do view it that way. And I'm always fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by the way that people fill in their perspectives. And so, with the Epstein files in particular, sorry, my sinuses are like, I have to apologize to the listeners, people watching me. My sinuses sometimes get very overactive. It's a lifelong condition. Um, uh, it, some people think I don't have a cold, actually. I just have overactive sinuses. And um, the thing I notice about the way that people are looking at Jeffrey Epstein, is people are rightly disgusted at what they see. I mean, I don't think it should be controversial to say that you're looking at an evil object when you're looking at the life and times of Jeffrey Epstein, and his, you know, uh, his travails. That's for sure. I don't think I will grate my audience with that observation. But I mean, the thing that really strikes me is the intelligence of the man. And that's like the thing that I think was like most disturbing to me. You know, um I spent like quite a bit of time, not like, I mean, what I think, a lot of people are focused on like what he did. And what he did is, a historical evil. It's an evil for the history books. And I've certainly found myself having to step away from my research and pace around my house or go for a walk, um, having read some of the stuff that I now know. Um, but what really like troubles me about the Epstein story was how remarkably intelligent Jeffrey Epstein was. And I'm not saying that to praise him. I'm saying that as just sort of an observation, that the term evil genius comes to mind, when I'm trying to characterize him. Um, because I'm always I'm always fascinated um by other like human minds, right? Like, I one of the things I do when I study philosophers and people from history, like Thomas Jefferson. If you've read my so I wrote a just to kind of give you some kind of sort of insight into sort of my intellectual curiosities, and how I approached this. I wrote, I when I started my Substack, I wanted to really, I've been sort of in my, over 20 years of my life, I've been sort of trying to develop a philosophical worldview, and I built, a whole series of intuitions about, how to think about life, right? Like, um, I have a very well-defined philosophical worldview that I talk about. It flows through in my writing, right? I wrote my Grand Praxis series, which is what I'm referring to, which was really for me was one. It was uh, it was experimental writing for me. I was writing in some registers that I'd really never played with before. Was playing with mythology, playing with uh, mixing registers and writing. I know this is all probably not what you all want to hear about. I'm just trying to just trying to really frame for those who are choosing to listen to me, sort of the way in which I approached sort of the Epstein files. Because, well, anyways, back to the Grand Praxis. There's the penultimate essay in the Grand Praxis. The grand finale is it's actually the piece that I'm most proud of, in the series of essays. And it features some characters from history. Thomas Jefferson, Christopher Hitchens, Albert Camus. There's a a brief a brief appearance in there of other figures. Um, Carl Sagan, sorry, that was a really important one. And um, and really, I mean, the reason why those characters appear in the Grand Praxis is because like um those these four characters sort of stand out for me, right? Like in my intellectual development as figures who had really large influences on me, right? Uh and in some ways like I wrote that essay, I kind of wrote that essay from myself in a way, to kind of like, walk back through my life and the things that I've learned in my intellectual pursuits. But like in the treatment of these four men that I mentioned in that piece, I was, I knew that like I was gonna write them into this um, completely fictional mythological scenario where the protagonist in the piece, which isn't meant to literally be me, by the way, like it's meant to be, um, it's meant to kind of be an open-ended question of like who like like it can be you or it could be me. You can imagine it's me if you want in the narrative. Um, it wasn't meant to sort of be like a literal representation of me inside my own mythology. If that wasn't clear, but like to the extent that I was representing these figures from history, like I knew I was doing something dangerous. I was actually doing something that like Christopher Hitchens probably wouldn't have liked, and I was quite sensitive to that. Hitchens himself, when he was alive, was um, he had quite a bit of disapprobation for the idea of talking on behalf of dead people, which I agree with. I think it's a very dangerous thing to do. So like when you ask yourself like what would a historical figure say if they were alive today, and that's a dangerous territory, right? Because the person's not here, and like you never lived inside their thoughts, and so you always run the danger of projecting your own biases into that person's personality. So when you say when I think about like what Christopher Hitchens might say, or what Albert Camus might say, or what Thomas Jefferson might say, um, or Carl Sagan might say, if they were here, um, I certainly recognize the sort of sacred duty one has to sort of like guard against the notion that you can speak for someone who's not here. And so when I wrote that piece and I was going to have dialogue from these figures from history, I was really sensitive to that. Uh, I I went back and watched a few episodes from Cosmos, and in the case of Carl Sagan, went back on YouTube and watched a lot of sort of like Christopher Hitchens like debates, and um, reread some of his books, his like interviews. Uh, I spent quite a bit of time thinking about reading a lot of correspondence from like Thomas Jefferson, his writings, uh, and things in history that were like said about him, and Camus as well. And I was because and it was and I was and I know it was just like only like a few lines of dialogue from these figures in this narrative, but I tried really hard to imagine how their personalities would manifest in that world, um because I do like to sort of try to put myself in people's shoes, and I also didn't want it to be self-congratulatory, right? Like in fact, like in the narrative, I was pretty careful to not have Hitchens like agree with me, right? Like to be like, look, Hitchens would agree with Mike Brock if he was alive. In fact, he promises that he's going to keep arguing with me in the narrative. I tried to be respectful of his belligerence. And so like, yeah, I try to be very, very careful and respect these figures. Um, and so yeah, I'm a careful study of you know, of the personalities and of figures, and I try to be really careful about that when I talk about such things. And I kind of tried to do it with Jeffrey Epstein too, right? Or over the last week, like I've tried to understand the man, because for me, to see something this evil, the scale of this, unbelievable scale of what this man did. I mean, he extorted, he entrapped and extorted people at billions of dollars to turn himself into a billionaire. Um, I mean, that alone, right, is crazy. And he did it by trapping people in compromising situations with underage young women and girls, which is uh, morally outrageous, to say the least. Um, but the thing that stood out to me, I sat through the 3-hour video that got dropped where of Steve Bannon interviewing him. That was pretty fascinating for me, because it's clear that you're looking at a man who is fiercely intelligent, who knows exactly what he's doing. He's placing words very, very carefully to achieve the desired effect, um, that he wants. And when, like, you sort of look at this, and you sort of think to yourself, like, well, because, I think, like, for a lot of people, you want to sort of think about intelligence as like a sort of good thing unto itself, right? Um, if someone has like a IQ of like 180, right, you want to think that that person's like good. It's good. It's a good thing that person's that smart. Um, but what happened, but like we should get a little bit philosophical here. I'm going to be philosophical today because I want to like talk about perspective today. I don't know how long I'm going to go, but I'm going somewhere with this. So if you want to stay with me, you can stay with me. If this gets too brainy and academic for you, you're welcome to drop off. But I'll keep going. Um, so the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who I talk about a lot, we talk about the is-ought distinction, Hume's guillotine, this idea that also known as, there's kind of, you can reframe it as the fact value distinction. Uh, it for those who aren't familiar, like, it just generally says that like there are rational systems of thought, right? Like logic. Logic is a rational system. So I'll give you an example. So, right, a nuclear bomb, the scariest piece of technology that humans have so far invented. Now, it took a lot of intelligence and science and reason to build that. But one could have built all of that for evil, right? The Germany in World War II had more advanced technology than the Allies, right? They had the V1 and V2 rockets. They developed the first jet fighters near the end of the war. And the only and in fact, like, the Apollo program to go to the moon was the result of uh, of appropriated German technology that the Americans took from the Nazis and repurposed it to create NASA and the American space program. This is well known. This isn't like historically controversial. Like, right? Like we I think it's a good thing, right? I mean, we should take the technology of evil people and repurpose it for good, you know? I mean, I think the same thing of like these Silicon Valley like billionaires, right? Like, I mean, I think, I think that electric cars are great. I think like Tesla's great. I think Teslas are a great product, or they have a shitty person. I think like hopefully one day like Tesla don't be controlled by Elon, and we'll have some actual like sane people running that company that will make that will make electric cars for people, right? It's like, the technology doesn't have anything to do with values. That's the point, right? Like, you know a hammer can be used to drive a nail, or it can be used to murder someone. It's instrumental. It's not a subject, right? In a normative frame. So Jeffrey Epstein was a very intelligent man, like very intelligent, fiercely so. This is evidenced not just by his communicative skills, his manipulative skills, his the sort of remarkable case of civilization scale sociopathy that the man demonstrated. And sociopaths are generally very intelligent people, right? Like that's actually that's a thing that we don't talk about, right? Like most sociopaths are like really high IQ individuals, like they are, right? Like, I mean, like some of the most famous serial killers in history, right? Like the Unabomber, right? Like have like IQs of like are like the Unabomber was like Einstein level, right? Like intelligence, and he behaved in that way, right? So intelligence has nothing to do with good or evil, and Jeffrey Epstein was a very intelligent man. Like certainly more intelligent, I think, than almost all the people he entrapped in his world, right? Like, I mean, like if you want my opinion on, say, like who's more intelligent, like Peter Thiel or Jeffrey Epstein, I would say Jeffrey Epstein would run circles around Peter Thiel in terms of his intelligence. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein was quite like adept at like he was an autodidact when it came to sort of scientific knowledge. He was really interested in quantum physics and complexity theory, like the work on information theory, emergence theory. Like he had like a relationship with the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. His relationship with Lawrence Krauss is emblematic of that part of his life. So this was a really intelligent man, right? Like he understood science, he understood finance, he understood politics. He had a pretty good grasp, I think, of human psychology, which is how he was able to control so many people so effectively and keep them quiet for so long. Like this level of conspiracy and entrapment is quite remarkable, right? Like this isn't something that like you know your average bad person can pull off without getting caught, right? Um, and then you're like, well, how did he avoid consequences for so long, right? And then you have to like look at that, and that for me was of great curiosity in my research over the past week, just trying to like ask myself like, now I mean, and now look, I mean, if you're if you're uh, if you're if you're a feminist, um, uh, you're you're probably going to want me to acknowledge, and I will, because it must be said that many women had accused Jeffrey Epstein of wrongdoing over the course of his life, and those women were not believed. Um, uh, and you know we I don't want to we the 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 fault that we all have, right, as a society, of like being unable to trust women when they tell these stories is a it's a pock on all of our houses as a society. um Especially people in positions of power and offices of public trust. So there's that, and that needs to be said. um and and one should sit with that for a moment, but I don't want to, and I don't want to minimize that point, but I do want to draw attention to the sort of insights and concerns that like I've drawn from my research, and really trying to catch myself up and really just understand like the full scope of this. um I think I think uh, Ro Khanna is, he sort of refers to this group of people as the Epstein class, which I think is like appropriate, but it's like it's complicated because I do think a lot. I just want to like state this, and I know that this will probably be a lot of these men I think should be in jail, right? Like, no, that being said, that's there's no question about that. I think, I mean, people who've like um participated in any way with the dehumanization of these women, these girls. However, I mean, it does seem that there are a lot of people that Jeffrey Epstein entrapped that weren't pedophiles, that didn't want to participate in any of that, but like he forced them into compromising situations and took pictures that he kept as compromat and as compromising material that he could then use to control people. And then once he could control them, he sort of drew them into his world and further compromised them over time. And you know that pattern of behavior over decades really is one of the most like mendacious evil things I've like ever seen, right? Like in the real world, right? Like, I mean, like for like one person to do on their own, right? Like not in concert with others. Like obviously, like it's not on the scale of say like the Holocaust or um the the sort of the Saipan massacre, like, I mean, or the Cambodian killing fields. Like, I'm not trying to put it on that level, but I mean, like, if you're sort of looking at it in terms of um if you're looking at it in terms of uh just like the sort of depravity of the individual, it's one of the most like sociopathic, evil, and honestly like sophisticated manipulation strategies that I've ever seen. Like it blows my mind truly, that he did this. He did it on purpose, and like, and I want to, and I also want to, like, talk about another aspect of his psychology that I find, or at least I think I found. I don't, uh, I've tried to learn it. Like I said, I've tried to learn as much about him as I can, and the 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 conclusion I kind of, the troubling conclusion I kind of come to when I'm looking at Epstein is that, like, on the question of pedophilia, is that, like, like, so, my perception, and and I we have lots of great research tools now. I use Perplexity Research. I think it's a great tool to find, a lot of, source material, tool primary materials, summarize things. And, you know, I get, like, the really strong sense, like, from the psychological community and mental health community, that, most pedophiles, right, are sort of, they're sort of suffering from, a compulsive behavior disorder. Um, in most cases, right? You know, it's essentially like it's like an evil kind of fetish, like anti-social fetish, that, is disgusting, and like, but I mean, like, there's, you know there's, you can kind of, like, look at it as somebody who has sort of, like, you know developed developed a sort of a compulsive behavior that's, like, deeply antisocial, and like, destructive. And then the question is like, is that what explains Jeffrey Epstein's predilection for what he did? And that, like, doesn't appear to be the case, right? I mean, it's almost like, when you look at the man's behavior, like did he have a compulsion for young girls, or was it like, or was he just a complete sociopath that recognized that, like, his what he was doing gave him power, gave him power over women and other men that he was able to compromise into those situations, and that for him the pedophilia was instrumental rather than compulsive. And so when you're, like, kind of parsing through someone's psychology, you're like, that's sort of like an interesting pattern, and that actually makes it more evil, right? Like, somebody, like somebody who's, like, a pedophile because, like, they just, like, y- you know they're just attracted to children, right? Like, that's a, you could argue that's a mental illness, right? That needs to be treated. But, like, was Jeffrey Epstein mentally ill, or was he just doing that because it served his sort of, like, broader, like sort of, normative goal, which seemed to be hedonistic in nature? And so that actually makes the pedophilia, like, even more evil, right, than the traditional case. Um, so so now you're, like, looking at this, like, incredibly evil object. So, like, this man who, like, I mean, he's IQ's probably in the 140s range, if not higher, just like based on like what he seems to understand about the world on a multidisciplinary basis. Fully understands what he's doing, seems to have deep intuitive understanding of human psychology, seems to plan entrapment scenarios, sophisticated entrapment scenarios, is managing like, you know, multiple complex manipulations across many people at a time, at all times. And he seems to get off on all of it. He seems to get off. There's this like sick hedonism of it all. This like deep cynicism. You know, it's like you're like it's like, you know, I'm not a theologian, but I mean, like, it's like, you know, I struggled to find another word other than demonic, you know, to describe. Like, you know, I'm laughing not to make light of it. It's just you know, one of my ticks is I sometimes laugh when I'm kind of overwhelmed by something, and it's overwhelming to think about like how demonic the man was. Um, and and just the scope of it. Um, and so yeah, I've been like kind of just floored by everything I've learned in the last week, and it's just sort of really underscored for me how um like how deeply uh corrupt uh this man, that's actually the wrong way of saying it, how deep the corruption this man was able to sort of impute on the culture of power, not just in the United States, across the world, right? Like, I mean, like I'm pretty sure he like I don't know for if I'm not accusing this, but like it's kind of, I mean the I mean the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, you know, has been to the island many times. Um, so, anyways, I have someone at my door, so and I wasn't expecting that. So, I'm gonna have to pause and come back to you guys. I apologize for this. I know this is a sort of a off-time thing. I will be back for those of you who want to stay around. But I'm going to pause for a moment and we can return. Hey guys, I'm gonna come back to you guys in a little bit. I'll send out a new link, but we will continue this discussion.